scary stories. I'm a senior in college. I have one roommate who's in her first year of a social work master's program. We have been good friends since freshman year, and this year decided to rent a small house together for a change of scenery. My first year living off of campus. Our university is in a shithole city, but it's small. The main problem is the layout. One street you are in a perfectly safe middle-class family territory, but one wrong turn and you are in gang turf. There's not a whole lot of room to get lost safely. My roommate and I don't live in the worst area, but I will say there's a reason our rent is cheap and why our landlords installed super bright motion detectors. We have been super strict about keeping everything locked up, keeping valuables out of sight of windows, trying to keep the fact that we are a couple of early 20-year-old females living alone on the down low. And besides one small incident the first month we were there, nothing had happened, and we generally felt pretty secure last semester. Class doesn't start until the 30th, but I headed back this past Sunday. Roommate has also been back for a couple of weeks because of her internship. This happened the night I got back, around 11 p.m. I was just hanging in the living room, watching movies. I had brought wine, and I had just turned 21 before New Year's, so this was a very exciting time for me. My roommate was sleeping over at her boyfriend's. I started hearing this tapping noise on the window by our front door. For a little while I just ignored it, pretty sure it was just my imagination. I still got a little freaked out being home alone at night. The blinds were down, so I couldn't see anything, but I was sure the motion lights would come on if someone was out there. As the time passes by, I realize that no, that's definitely tapping, and it's moving from one window to the next, progressively getting closer to where I'm sitting. I muted the TV to listen better, and as soon as I did, the tapping paused, and then came back louder and much faster. At this point, I'm frozen, totally freaked out, but when the tapping moved to the window next to my head, I grabbed my phone and slid off the couch, crawled into the kitchen where we have a glass sliding door, and peered out. It was hard to make out, but thankfully the kitchen lights were off, which made it a little bit easier to see outside, and the lights coming through the living room windows combined with some lights from the street lamps just barely allowed to see a man crouched in the garden, face pressed against the glass, and I mean smushed right up against it. He had one hand stretched way above his head, which looked really awkward, and was tapping with a couple of fingers. I think he was trying different windows because he couldn't see inside well and didn't know where I was sitting, except that the living room was the only room in the house with lights on. Or at least that's what I was hoping when I crawled out of the living room, down the hall, and into my bedroom. I locked the door but kept the lights off. If he really didn't know what part of the house I was in, I didn't want him to figure it out. And I called the police. They asked if he was actively trying to break in the house, and I said no, and they said they would send someone over as quickly as possible. I was really hoping the officer would stay on the line with me, but they just gave me instructions to call again if things escalated, and to hold tight. 15 minutes later, still no police. I wasn't sure if he was out there, but I wasn't going to try and find out on my own. I had been trying to call my roommate, but she wasn't answering her phone, and I didn't know who else to call. Eventually, I decided to call my ex-boyfriend, because he had been my go-to person for the last 2 years, and I couldn't think of anyone else. He's a good dude and still came over since he lives only a few minutes away. Around 10 minutes after I called him, I could tell he was there because I could hear shouting and then running. About 5 minutes or so, another 5 minutes or so, and he calls and says he's out front and to let him in. He told me there was a dude with a small bag at the kitchen door, peering in and trying to force the door open. He yelled and the guy dropped the bag and started running. My ex chased him a little bit until they got to this one road towards the back of my neighborhood. Then he headed back. Motion lights didn't come on this whole time. A few minutes later, the cops came. It was only a little over a half an hour since I called them, but it felt like so much longer. Cops searched the area, didn't find anyone. The only thing that was in the bag was lube and a box of condoms, which makes me want to die if I think about it too hard. I didn't have a solid description of him. The cops said they would keep someone outside, and my ex spent the night in the living room to keep an eye on me. My roommate finally called me back at 7 in the morning, asking me what had happened. Her boyfriend has also spent the night every night since. Honestly, I don't know if I was just shocked or trying to process the whole thing. Even though I knew the guy was still out there, my roommate called our landlords up and bitched them out about the lights not working. I went to work and told my coworkers about it. My roommate called me as soon as she got out of her internship, freaking out, and told me she had something to tell me. So her intern with the social work program has her working with and occasionally leading a group of court-ordered drug addicts, which includes some sex offenders. She told me that while she was leading a group, she was just not getting along with one of the members, one of the sex offenders, who was being very contrary and just acting annoyed with what she was saying. And towards the end, he said something along the lines of, "Your roommate is cute. You can tell her I like Asian girls, and that we need to fix our front porch light. It's out." I'm pretty sure that he didn't have an opportunity to see my face that night, so I don't know how many times he's been there. She reported him. Her supervisors got in contact with the police, and he confessed easily. I guess he probably followed my roommate home one night, which is terrifying to me, and I'm glad he never tried to do anything to her. And he also must have known that she would report him after he said those things to her, so I don't understand his thinking there at all. It's just today that I'm starting to really feel freaked out about the whole thing, and I will probably not be spending the night alone here for a while. Now the whole family has a restraining order on him. Here's my sister's stalker. Sorry to be vague in the background here, but there's a lot of personal identifying information. She met him in a sketchy place. They dated for a while. He ended up being an unhinged heroin dealer. She changed her number and got a new boyfriend, and he went insane and started harassing the rest of us to try and scare us into giving him her information. At one point, he was threatening to tell my fiancé I was cheating on him to extort info from me. It didn't work, and was actively trying to figure out where I lived. As he successfully found the address of the place I lived a couple of months before this happened, he used those apps that gave you a random phone number so we couldn't block him. He started pretending to be members of the family on these fake numbers to try to get information. I changed my number, and he somehow found it, and they pretended to be a little old lady attempting to get a hold of one of her grandkids via text to make sure it was me. He also used his family members' Facebook pages to harass us when we blocked him on his own Facebook. He hasn't done any of the things he threatened to do, thankfully. So, let's not meet again, you stupid idiot. My parents are divorced, and because of this, I visit my dad, stepmom, and younger brother every other weekend. I do not enjoy going to my dad's house, not because I don't enjoy his company or anything of the sort, but because of an incident that occurred nearly 2 years ago. My dad doesn't live in the ghetto like most other stories claim. He lives in a trailer park, truly living up to the standard of Oklahoma living. It's not uncommon for people addicted to meth to live in these places for a couple of weeks before they are evicted or arrested. It was my weekend to go to my dad's house. I got there, and we visited and ate dinner and such as families do. My dad and stepmom had already put my baby brother to bed, and they had went to sleep themselves. After about 30 or so minutes, I also fell asleep on the couch in the living room. They are not in the financial situation to set up a room for me on my own. I wake up to the sound of loud banging on the paper-thin door of the trailer house. I didn't freak out at this point due to the groggy stupor just waking up had put upon me, as if it were the middle of the Sunday afternoon and I had gotten a polite knock on the door from a neighbor to ask to borrow sugar for their cake. I started to answer the door. I fumbled with the lock, but luckily I didn't have the function to even close the unblocking of the 3 locks they have. I finally fully woke up and realized what the hell it was I was doing. I started to panic because I heard the voice of a man who sounded like a stereotypical redneck say, "I know you were in there. Now let me in." I suppose he knew I was inside because he heard me messing with the locks. I didn't dare say anything back to the deranged man on the other side of the weak door that had surprisingly not gave in from his relentless pounding on it. After he said this, he started to kick the door. I didn't piece that together at the time because all I heard was loud thuds slamming against the door. But later I found out that he had used the guardrail on the porch as leverage to position himself between the railing and our front door, kicking it. My reasoning for knowing that is because the next day the flimsy railing was bowed outward right in front of the door, where he had leaned back on it. His screams and attempts to bust through the door somehow did not manage to wake up either my dad or stepmom, so I bolted to their room and burst in and almost hesitated to wake them up in fear I would somehow get in trouble for this. The man's screams grow louder and louder, and he said something about how he deeply missed me. This still tends to freak me out, thinking about what he said. How could the man miss me if he didn't know me? I knew that I sure as hell didn't know him by the sound of his voice. I woke up my parents. They jumped out of bed after seeing the horror on my face and hearing the wails of the man outside. They both ran to the front door and yelled from the other side of the cardboard cutout that kept this creeper from doing God knows what, and yelling, "Get away, we are calling the police." The man yelled back, but in pain, as if it sounded like he had fallen down our stairs. He did. After we heard the agony-filled screech, we heard a screech of a different kind as he peeled out of our driveway, and what sounded like a truck of some sort. My dad opened the door to see if he could catch his license plate. Of course, he couldn't, as the creepy-ass guy had already hightailed it out of there, and it was the middle of the night. As most criminals of his caliber were, this man was clearly a coward. He had fled at only the sound of another adult's voice. I'm not complaining, though. I was glad this guy was gone. Clearly, he was out of his mind or dealing with some sort of substance abuse, if not both. Nothing like this has ever happened at their house again. that doesn't mean that it's not unnerving to be there and try to sleep in their living room, because believe me, it is. The experience wouldn't have been quite as scary if it weren't for him saying that he missed me. That always stayed with me. I'm not sure what he meant by that or what his motive was for trying to break in, but I think I'm better off not knowing. It scares me to think that he could show back up there at any time, not just because he could hurt me while I visit, but he could also hurt my baby brother, who is only a couple of years old. It also scares me to think that if it wasn't for all of the locks put on the door by my dad being too cautious, I could have let the psycho into the house. As I said before, he hasn't came back, and I hope he doesn't. So, creepy guy who tried to break into my dad's house because you missed me, let's not meet again.